Well, good afternoon. We're talking about loss today and the emotions of loss. Are you struggling with a significant loss? It does not have to be loss just due to the death of somebody, although that is the key one and the one that we most acknowledge and support. But there are other sorts of losses, such as the loss of a partner due to divorce or separation. And this still has an impact. Or maybe you recently retired and you're not working anymore. This is a loss as well. There's a loss of the sense of purpose and community. You could have a loss due to a significant move, like across the country, and suddenly you do not have your family or community to support you. And on a physiological level, you can experience grief. Or maybe you lost your job. This is probably one of the most devastating losses, and there is very little support. There are some support groups for people, but not in the way that there's support groups for people who have lost due to death, because our culture does not understand grief. Our culture, the American, the Western culture, treats our emotions as optional, that we can just tamp them down and we can go on. The reality is that we cannot. The emotions that are triggered by loss have a physiological component. That is, our responses to loss are tied into a survival response, a physiological survival response in which chemicals are released into the body to prepare the body to fight, flee, or freeze. Think about it. Any one of those losses, do you ever feel angry and wanting to punch somebody out? That's the fight response. Maybe you are so overwhelmed that all you want to do is sit in front of the TV and binge watch. Or maybe you drink, or maybe you're overeating. Those are other responses. Those are the flee response. And then the third option is the freeze. And this could be you just can't get out of bed. You can't even face the world. And literally, it hurts. The emotions of loss hurt. They actually have a place in our body that really hurts. Some people are, hi, thank you for joining. Some people are very adept at tamping down their feelings, and that's what our culture expects you to do, especially if you're working. They don't, if you lose a significant partner, a significant family member, they give you 3 days of bereavement. And I got to tell you, grief can last way longer than that. In fact, the first 3 months of a significant loss, you might find that your brain is fuzzy and that it's difficult to concentrate. Well, that's because the neural nets in the neurological structure in your brain has actually been impacted, almost in the same way that your body might be impacted by a blow or an accident, that the brain literally cannot compute the loss that you're going through. So you may have noticed this survival response in your own behavior. For example, after a loss of somebody due to death, you might find that the family gets into arguments. We don't know how to grieve, and so instead we argue and fight. Not to mention that there's this structural thing that happens in the family if a significant person has been lost, that just sets everybody else adrift. Or you may have noticed your own avoidance behavior. And certainly you might have noticed the fuzzy thinking. Now, generally, this goes away in about 3 months. But that doesn't mean the end of your grief. That means that now you really feel it. Now the fuzziness is really the body's shock response that insulates you from the full impact. Hi, thank you for joining. We're talking about loss and grief. So the fuzziness is actually a shock response of the body that protects you from the full impact of the loss. And oftentimes our avoidance behaviors, such as hyperbusyness or drinking or drugs or binge eating, those are also efforts to insulate us from the full impact of a loss. So as a psychosocial analyst and PhD person who has been working with people around significant life changes, helping them navigate, I have found that the first thing that you have to do in terms of dealing with loss is to release the emotions around the loss, because they actually reside in our body. The fight, flee, freeze response releases chemistry in our body. And if you don't release that, it gets trapped and it stays there and it doesn't go away. And it can make you sick. So the Harvard School of Public Health did a study and found that people who had had a significant loss were 21 times more likely to have a heart attack than people who had not had a significant loss. And it doesn't go away. I have worked with clients who came to me that had been grieving the loss of a partner or a husband for 20 and even 60 years. It doesn't go away. And the bad aspect of it is that it affects your relationships. So I had one woman who came to me and she had lost her husband 20 years ago and she was still actively grieving. I mean, tears streaming down her eyes. And the relationship problem, was that she had moved to the Bay Area, and whenever she would see her son, her adult son, she would cry. And this was very stressful to him. It was very upsetting. So she came to me to help her release those, to change the behavior, which started with releasing the emotions. And that's what I do. I enable people to do that, to do it fairly quickly. In fact, after a month, she had stopped crying in front of her son. Now, another woman I worked with, she had lost her husband. She didn't grieve him. She got into another relationship, and that relationship actually alienated her to her daughters and her granddaughters. And some 60 years later, she comes to me saying, my children don't need me. They don't care about me. They treat me like I'm, an unwelcome guest. And so we worked on the emotions, and then that enabled her to also work on her relationships. So what I teach my clients is how to release their emotions, but also how to work with their relationship with other people. And if you like what you're hearing and would like to have a conversation with me, click on the link in the comments section. We can have a 15-minute talk in which I can explain how I work with people and whether or not we're a fit. Now, another thing that happens with a significant loss is how it impacts your community. So if you lose a person to death, your community initially is very, very supportive. They're there for you because we as a culture do acknowledge grief, especially grief, the loss of a partner or the loss of a child or even the loss of a parent, that is acknowledged, and so we get some support. The problem is grief fatigue. Oftentimes, our emotional response, because we don't know how to release our emotions, continues long past the ability of most of our communities to support us. That's why it's so important to work on this. The other problem is that people can get habituated to their grief. I ran into this when I was leading hospice support groups at hospice. I came into the group, it was an ongoing group, and there were women who had been there for 2 and 3 years. And they had enshrined their husbands, idolized it, and were achieving a lot of attention through their identification as a widow. So it's important, if you want more to your life than to be a griever, to start to deal with the emotional and mental results or reactions of loss. Because the brain is building new neural networks the whole time that you're going through the grief. And if you come later, you actually have to redo the new neural networks if they're in the way. So community, right. So I was telling you about community and how that affects, sorry, I needed to check my notes. So how that affects you if you had a loss due to death. Now think about, what is it like when you have a loss due to divorce? Oftentimes your community is split, that some of the people go with your partner or your spouse and ex-spouse, and the others go with you. Or maybe you lose them all because it turns out they were all with him. Or maybe they just don't want to be around you anymore because now you're a single woman and you are scary. Or they don't want to be around you because it's disturbing to see that somebody that you really knew for a long time that had what seemed like a viable relationship breaks up. It's like, oh, that might happen to me. Oh, it might be catching. So when you lose your partner, you can also lose your community. Oh, back to the loss due to death. I worked with one woman and she discovered that her whole community was there based on hers and her husband's efforts to support them. And when she was going through her grief, she wasn't able to show up in the same way. When you are in grief, actually it's a good experience because you become selfish. And a lot of us do not have that practice of being selfish. And she became selfish, and her friends didn't want to. Hi, thank you for joining. So her friends were talking about grief and loss and some of the things that happen. One of the things that happens is that we lose our community. And even when you have a loss due to death, you can lose your community because you find out who your friends really are. And sometimes the people that show up were people that you didn't even think were that close. So you never know. It really literally rewrites your address book. So another way in which you experience that communal loss, say you have retired. So you lose your connection to your coworkers. And you lose your sense of meaning. Why are you here in this world? And that's another really very important component of being a human being, is having a purpose or meaning in life. So losing to retirement, everybody's thinking, oh, how great that you're retired. But I've seen people who have retired, and oftentimes they come down with a life-threatening illness within weeks, if not months, if not weeks of their retirement. It's like they no longer know why they're here. I went to a high school graduation a couple of years back, the 50th graduation, I shouldn't say the 50th year anniversary, and there were a lot of retired members of my class. And what I found was interesting is that the people who looked the best and the most youthful, hi Lisa, thank you for joining. So the people who looked most youthful were those people who were still actively engaged in their lives. So retirement is one of the other losses that can have a huge impact on your grief and your relationship with others. Now, another one that I was mentioning before was when you move to a new location, you really get dislocated from your support system. And that is a significant loss. And it's going to take time for you to rebuild your relationships, to create new connections. I moved to the Bay Area. I moved to the Bay Area, I guess 20 years ago. And it took maybe 5 years before I actually had a full supportive community. And this is important. Now, if you move after a significant loss, then you really are asking for a lot from yourselves. Hi, thank you for joining. I'm talking about grief and loss and the emotional response that comes from loss. So I've talked about the actual emotions that come and that they are physiological and that you need to release them. There's a communal loss, and then there are the thoughts. And that's probably the hardest because they can really reproduce the emotional trauma over and over again if we don't manage our thoughts. And they're very hard to manage. We rethink how the loss happened. We go over it and over it again. How could it have been different? Or, if, say, it's retirement, you may think about, well, who am I now? And I'm worthless. And these thoughts make the body feel unsafe. And so that triggers the survival response. So you get this loop that goes around and around. So you need to deal with the thoughts. Now, another aspect, which just sort of hit me today because we're going through the holidays, is the calendar. What's going on in the world right now can have an impact on the intensity of your emotions. So the holiday times, if you have lost a partner, or you've lost a family member, or you've lost your community in some way, the holidays are very, very difficult. First of all, you're feeling crappy because you feel disconnected, isolated, alone. You may still be grieving, or maybe you remember the good times and that makes you grieve. And so people don't want to be around you. Plus, they're all happy, and you, in contrast, they have a psychological term called relative deprivation. If they're doing good and you're not doing good, then you can really, really feel bad. Hi, Irene. Thank you for joining. So I'm talking about grief and loss and the emotions and how it affects how we feel, and how it affects when we have a loss, how that affects our community. And because we're social animals, we're social beings, we actually need community to survive. And there are many ways in which when we have a loss, and it doesn't have to be loss. Hi, Irene, thank you. Love to you too. It doesn't have to be loss of a partner. It could be many different kinds of loss, and you may want to re-listen to this Facebook Live to hear the other kinds of losses. So let's see. So the other thing that happens during the holidays, as you're navigating this loss, the emotions of loss, thank you, Aaron, is that you can feel desperate. And when you reach out to people, they feel that desperation, and that they pull back even more. And then you feel the rejection of that. And so you feel the isolation even more. It's a really, really hard time. And if you are not going through loss, I really invite you to reach out to people that you know who have gone through a significant loss, because it's a really, really hard time for them. And it's so easy to get isolated. It's so easy to feel in despair. But if it's you that's going through this, I invite you to click on the link over there in the comments section and have a conversation with me and find out how I can support you, how I work and what my fees are, so that you can see if we can work together, whether we're resonant. This is not going to go away. That's the main thing. I already pointed out that I have had clients who have come to me after 20 and even 60 years because they never dealt with the loss of a partner. And this grief continues to affect your body and literally affect your health if you don't address it. Now, sometimes it affects your health literally because you're doing things that are destructive to your body, like drinking or overeating or computer games or workaholism, but it also affects your body all by itself, because when you don't release those emotions, they actually, it leaves a chemistry in your body that affects your immune system, so you can actually get sick. They found there's this widower syndrome of widows or widowers who had taken care of their loved ones during the time that they were dying, and would often get sick right after they died. Now, part of that is that they were working so hard that finally, I mean, and there was a survival response there. They were using all their resources. And then when their partner, or the person they were caring for, could be a parent, died, they had no more resources. They were depleted, and that led to sickness. And if it's a partner loss, I got to tell you, the connection, the number of people who die after their partners or their spouses within several months to a year, it's really high. Although in the first few months is especially high. Therefore, it behooves you to allow your feelings, to get help, to get support, to make sure that you are getting the emotional needs that you have met. So that's my Facebook share today. To, number one, to release your emotions. Number two, to make sure that you have community. And number three, watch your thoughts, because they are going to can actually re-trigger the emotional response. So you kind of get caught in this loop. And then finally, this is a hard time right now. The end of the year, the going into the dark time, and also the holidays, and the fact that we're going to a new year. And you want to set yourself up to be prepared for that new year. I mean, wouldn't that be much better? If you were to have a magic wand, what would you like to create for your new year, for your life after loss? And if it makes you excited, that's a really good sign. But if it makes you feel depressed or overwhelmed or feeling inadequate, then that's a sign that you need to reach out to somebody. And if you resonate with this, you might want to reach out to me. That's all I have for today. Hope you enjoyed this. Happy holidays, and be brilliant.